The European mindset: Africa as a land, not a people. By the late 19th century, Europe saw Africa as a vast, untapped resource rather than a continent of sovereign nations. European powers viewed Africans as subjects to be ruled rather than partners to be negotiated with. This mindset was rooted in centuries of Eurocentric thinking, reinforced by the transatlantic slave trade and colonial expansion. During the age of exploration and colonial expansion, European leaders often dismissed African governance structures as primitive. They justified their conquest with the notion of the civilizing mission, the belief that they were bringing progress to supposedly backward societies. This racist ideology provided the foundation for their refusal to include Africans in discussions about the continent's future, the balance of power in Europe. At the time of the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, Africa had not yet been fully colonized. European nations were competing for dominance, and tensions between them threatened to escalate into war. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who hosted the conference, was primarily concerned with maintaining peace among European nations rather than considering African interests. Bismarck's goal was to prevent conflict between European powers while securing Germany's place as a global empire. To achieve this, European leaders needed to agree on how to divide Africa among themselves. Including African representatives would have complicated the process, as they would have resisted the division and insisted on sovereignty. European disregard for African sovereignty. Africans had well-established kingdoms, empires, and governance systems before European colonization. The Kingdom of Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, and many others had complex political structures, military strategies, and diplomatic relations. However, Europeans dismissed these systems as illegitimate, often portraying African rulers as despots or tribal leaders rather than heads of state. Some African leaders, such as King Leopold II of Belgium, had already begun making secret deals with local rulers, coercing them into signing treaties that they did not fully understand. These treaties were then used to justify European claims to African lands. European powers believed that they had already negotiated with Africa through these deceptive agreements and saw no need for further African input. Fear of African resistance. If African rulers had been invited to the Berlin Conference, they would have strongly opposed the division of their lands. Many African leaders had already resisted European encroachment through diplomacy and military conflicts. By excluding Africans, European leaders avoided direct confrontation and opposition during the conference itself. For example, King Menelik II of Ethiopia successfully resisted Italian colonization at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. The Zulu Kingdom, under Shaka and later Cetshwayo, fiercely fought British expansion. European leaders understood that African resistance was strong, and allowing African leaders a voice in Berlin could have disrupted their plans for easy annexation. A precedent of European decision-making. The Berlin Conference was not the first instance of Europeans making decisions about Africa without African input. Treaties, commercial agreements, and military actions had long been executed without African consultation. European powers had already established protectorates and colonies without consent, so excluding Africans from the conference was simply a continuation of this pattern. Moreover, inviting African leaders would have forced European nations to acknowledge African sovereignty. This would have contradicted their goal of justifying colonization under the guise of bringing civilization to uncivilized lands. The lasting consequences. The exclusion of Africans from the Berlin Conference had devastating long-term effects. European powers drew arbitrary borders that ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions. These artificial boundaries created tensions that still persist today, fueling conflicts, political instability, and economic challenges across the continent. By not inviting Africans, European leaders ensured that Africa will be controlled by foreign interests for decades. Even after independence movements swept the continent in the mid-20th century, many African nations struggled with the colonial legacy imposed by the Berlin Conference. Conclusion: Africans were not invited to the Berlin Conference because European powers did not view them as equals. The conference was designed to divide Africa among European nations, not to negotiate with African leaders. The racist ideologies, economic ambitions, and strategic interests of European powers took precedence over the rights and sovereignty of African peoples. The consequences of this exclusion are still felt today, as Africa continues to navigate the challenges imposed by colonial borders and foreign intervention. Understanding this history is crucial in recognizing the resilience of African nations and the ongoing efforts to reclaim agency over their own destinies.